come to order. I'm looking at the title of this hearing, CBP Oversight, Examining the Evolving Challenges Facing the Agency. I was talking to Mr. Morgan earlier. I'm wondering if he could have foretold the future before he took this position, whether he would have done so. I mean, it's just been, challenges, yes, crisis after crisis after crisis. So I first want to say, thank the witness, thank Mr. Morgan for your perseverance, for your service to this nation, both past, present, and in the future too. Things aren't getting a whole lot better anytime soon, I fear. I would ask consent that my written opening statement be entered in the record. It's a hearing on the border. We haven't had one for quite a few months, so I obviously need to use a chart, and that's really what I want to talk about in my opening comments. We've held, I think, close to 40 hearings on some aspect of the issues on the border and with our horribly broken immigration system. Began keeping this chart, particularly on unaccompanied children, but then as the whole issue with people coming across and exploiting our asylum laws, coming as families, the problem just exploded in late 2018 and into 2019. And the main reason I want to show this chart, you can see the gold-colored bars are single adults, down slightly, but that's been pretty persistent, pretty stable for the 8 years that this chart represents. What you do see, though, in red is unaccompanied children, blue are the family units. And again, you can see the explosion of the family units drawn by the incentives of our broken immigration system, where they really crescendoed in May of 2019. I'm not going to put the chart up, but you all have a little spreadsheet here where we've been keeping track of monthly averages. In May of 2019, we were averaging 4,651 individuals either crossing illegally between the ports of entry or showing up at the ports claiming asylum. 4,651 people per day. The most recent month where we have consolidated figures, that number's down to about 745 people per day. And when it comes to an approximate number of children, it's down to about 50 a day, 49 a day. So we have made a huge level of progress. And I did want to point out, particularly with this chart, it's not just because of COVID. I think that has definitely reduced the numbers, but we had made dramatic reductions prior to that because of some of the programs that CBP has implemented. I know some of them not everybody agrees with, but from my standpoint, it's extremely important that we enforce our laws, and I know that's certainly what Mr. Morgan agrees with as well. So again, I think this has been some tremendous progress. In my own mind, I'm thinking, what would it have been like if COVID hit when we were at May 2019 numbers at close to at 4,651 people per day showing at the border, with CBP personnel having to deal with that. It would have been completely overwhelming. It was overwhelming back then, but throw COVID on top of that. So it's, again, congratulations, very good work at bringing the numbers down before this crisis hit. And we obviously extend our condolences to the family members of the CBP officers who lost their life because they've contracted COVID and others that have contracted as well. So you're still dealing with enormous challenges. I'm certainly looking forward to hear your testimony in terms of how you've handled it, how you're trying to deal with it today. And again, thank you for your service. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Acting Commissioner Morgan. Thank you for being here today. It's always good to see you. Mr. Chairman, before I make my statement, I have three statements, one from Human Rights First, one from Kids in Need of Defense, and a testimony from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that I would like to enter into the record by unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Customs and Border Protection certainly has played a vital role on the front lines of our nation's efforts to limit the spread of COVID-19 and, as always, to keep Americans safe. Even in the face of this deadly virus that has affected millions around the globe and killed more than 120,000 Americans, The men and women of the CBP continue to do their essential jobs and protect our national security in very difficult situations. However, CBP service has not been without sacrifice, and I want to acknowledge the losses that your agency has suffered during this pandemic. The lives of officers is a terrible, terrible price to pay, and I think I speak for all members of this committee when I express my grief and condolences to the families and to everyone at CBP. In order to prevent more tragedy at the agency, we must ensure that frontline agents and Customs and Border Protection officers have access to the personal protective equipment necessary to defend themselves against COVID-19. We count on these officers to keep us safe, but we cannot do so effectively if they can't do it effectively if they themselves are left unprotected. Even in normal times, the agency plays an important role in border states like my home state in Michigan, and as we are all aware, these are far from normal times. In the face of the coronavirus, CBP has been tasked with limiting unnecessary travel between Canada and the United States, while continuing to support trade and essential services, including the vital medical professionals who cross the border to support Detroit's efforts to combat COVID-19. As the nation looks to reopen, cross-border communities in states like Michigan will rely on clear and well-communicated information about plans for loosening restrictions at the border. We must avoid confusion and uncertainties that occurred as these restrictions were announced and were implemented. As we continue reopening, more trade and travelers will be returning to our nation's ports of entry, especially at airports and land crossings. And we must be diligent in applying the lessons learned over the past few months to ensure that CBP is ready to safely meet these very challenging circumstances. As we continue to move forward, we must strive to both implement strong safety and security measures and uphold our nation's long-held values for the families and children who continue to seek asylum at our southern border. CBP's priorities are often difficult to balance, but the agency cannot simply abandon one part of their mission because things get tough. Congress and the administration must work together to support effective trade, travel, migration, and security operations, particularly in this time of pandemic. So again, Mr. Morgan, thank you for taking the time to be with us here today. I look forward to your testimony and hearing what we can do to assist you in facing these extensive challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Peters. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you'll please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated. Mr. Mark Morgan is the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Official performing the duties of the Commissioner at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He began serving his country as a U.S. Marine and his community in local law enforcement. After completing a 20-year career in the FBI, Mr. Morgan started at the Department of Homeland Security as the Acting Assistant Commissioner for Internal Affairs before being appointed by President Obama as Chief of the U.S. Border Patrol. He served as Chief until January 2017. He later returned to DHS as the Acting Director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement in May of 2019 and has been leading U.S. Customs and Border Protection since July of 2019. Mr. Morgan.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the many challenges facing the United States Customs and Border Protection. Of course, topping the list of those challenges is the global COVID-19 pandemic. Infectious diseases, as we know, they don't know borders, and it serves as another example of why border security is so important. Today and every day, individuals arriving at our borders with or without COVID symptoms pose potential public health risks to the American people, our frontline personnel, our healthcare workers, and our community. As we've discussed before, CBP encounters travelers and illegal aliens from more than 130 countries in a given year, most of which are also currently facing significant COVID-19 outbreaks. Thankfully, several early presidential proclamations temporarily suspended the entry of travelers from certain countries. And as was mentioned, CBP, along with other USG personnel, were on the front lines of enforcing those critical and essential containment and mitigation strategies. These actions, no doubt, saved American lives early on, and I'm proud of the CBP workforce for their efforts. Moreover, CDC issued a public health order on March 20th of this year, finding that the introduction of persons who would likely be held in congruent settings in the ports of entry and Border Patrol stations increases the risk to public health. The CDC order has been a critically important tool in the fight against this public health crisis. It allows CBP to prevent the introduction and further spread of this virus in an effort to protect the American people, our workforce, and the immigrants themselves. Let's be clear, this order is not about immigration enforcement. It's about taking immediate and decisive actions to address the public health threat that still continues today. And early on, after that order, we saw those trying to illegally enter our country drop by more than 50% from our pre-COVID numbers. And rather than introducing the illegal aliens into our facilities, increasing the exposure risk to our workforce and our country, CBP, because of this order, is returning approximately 95% of those that we encounter expeditiously to their country of last transit. And as the chairman said, can you imagine what would we be going through right now if we were going through this pandemic this same time last year, when our southwest border facilities were overwhelmed and overcrowded with families and children? At one point, we had more than 20,000 individuals in our custody. Introducing a single COVID migrant into these conditions would have been catastrophic. And I hope we're united that we must work together to prevent those conditions from ever happening again. Now, we're averaging about 150 to 200 people in our custody at any given time, and we've seen a 70% reduction in unaccompanied minors. And as the chairman said, it is important to note that CBP and DH as a whole were already better positioned to deal with this global pandemic because of the success of the administration's network of immigration policies and initiatives that had been in place 10 months prior to COVID. These initiatives, as well as our partnership with the government of Mexico and Central American countries, had already reduced the flow of illegal migration by 76% from the height in May of 2019. Our in-custody numbers went from 20,000 to just over 3,400. And the driving force behind the crisis, families from the Northern Triangle country, have been reduced by 94%. And we had all but ended catch and release. And even as CBP shifted our resources to mitigate the spread of this deadly virus, we maintained and continued our efforts against a vast, complex, and challenging array of threats. This year, fiscal year to date, we've seized over 500,000 pounds of drugs, an increase from the same time last year. And although the cartels had to adjust their tactics because of COVID, they're alive and well, and they adjusted quickly. In fact, just after the first few months of this year, we saw a little bit of a downward departure at the beginning, but then soon after that, last May, they began to skyrocket back up. We saw a significant increase this past May. Methamphetamine seizures alone jumped 66%. This is why border security is national security. This is why borders matter, and importantly, why the wall matters as well. Lastly, while many in our country are self-quarantining or working from home, the majority of the CBP workforce does not have that option. They get up every day, they say goodbye to their loved ones, and they go to work protecting this nation. They are frontline defenders, as was just said already. They are good, decent, honorable people who heroically carry out CBP's broad mission day after day, despite the risk to their own health and safety. And I personally want to thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Peters, for your acknowledgement of the 7 CBP personnel that we've lost this year. That's personal, and I sincerely appreciate you knowing that, understanding that, and acknowledging that. That means a lot, that we can be united in acknowledging their sacrifices and the dedication to this country and the citizens they protect. I personally thank you for that, and I'm looking forward today to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Now, without a doubt, the men and women of CBP, from my standpoint, they're heroes. We are witnessing now an assault against law enforcement. I don't know why, how that could even possibly be a solution. And the same thing is true in terms of enforcing and securing our borders as well. Again, think of the situation we would have been in. My first question really has to do, moving forward, anticipating what we're going to be dealing with, let's say August, September, October of this year. This is far different from the position we were in May of 2019 when America's unemployment rate was at record lows across all demographic lines. And of course, those opportunities that only America is really known for was a huge draw, combined with our broken system that could be exploited. Now we're going to have, I would anticipate, unemployment levels in excess of 10%. We're going to have Americans out of work, but we're also going to have economic hardship in countries south of our border as well. How are you going to cope with that? I mean, just talk a little bit about what your plans are and what you think the challenge is going to be.
Yes, sir. So first of all, I think you're spot on. And so right now, what we're going through right now with the CDC order, as I mentioned, really is from a public health perspective. But at some point, COVID, we are going to get on the other side of COVID. And my concern, I share your concern, is that what we are seeing right now is that while our economy is struggling, it is by far worse in Mexico, Northern Triangle countries, really in the Western Hemisphere. So what I'm concerned is we're going to see the same pull factors that we have historically, but it's going to be magnified because what we like to say is the accelerant of COVID is that we're going to see these countries, their economic conditions are going to be far worse than ours. And we anticipate that we're going to see an increase, another surge of migration due to the economic conditions and the economic pull factor coming forward. It is a significant concern for us.
So for years I've been saying, as we face this crisis at our border, that the first goal is to reduce the flow of people coming in, exploiting our system, breaking our laws. Describe some of those programs that, again, I realize not everybody agrees with them, but I think it's hard to disagree with the results. We've reduced the flow. Talk about those programs, what was most effective, and will they remain effective?
Yes, sir.
And are they going to be challenged?
Yes, sir. I'll take the latter first. So, yes, they're challenged. They've always been challenged, and I'm assuming they're going to continue to be challenged. But, as you said, although we may philosophically disagree, as the acting commissioner of CBP, from our perspective, they've been effective with the goal of reducing the flow of illegal immigration. Sir, you're spot on. We have a multitude of programs that we're working with the Northern Triangle countries. I think most people are familiar with the ACA, the Asylum Cooperative Agreement. And that is where those that transit through a country and come to our border, for example, we send them to Guatemala where they can go through the asylum process there in Guatemala. It's been effective. Another program I know everyone here is familiar with is the MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocol. That has been an unbelievably effective program, probably the most successful program that we have. And it has absolutely, within a few months of its application, we started seeing a significant decrease in those that were trying to illegally enter the country because of that. There's a couple other programs, PACER and HARP, and sir, I think you know them well because they really mirrored what you started, Operation Safe Return, I believe last year, and I know there's other members of this committee that kind of joined you of how we can still give them the due process according to our laws that they deserve with respect to the law. How can we do that more effectively, more efficiently? Basically, in a nutshell, that means we're just bringing the whole of government approach to the border and we're doing it more efficiently. And we've done that. Again, conceptually the same as Operation Safe Return. That's been effective as well. So as we're anticipating the increase of the flow coming because the economic conditions driving the pull factors that always have, these programs are going to be absolutely essential to continue to stem the flow.
Do you have any doubt, had you not initiated those programs, implemented them, carried them out, that we wouldn't be at those, in excess of 4,000 people per day?
I'm sorry, sir. There's no doubt in my mind without those programs, we would still be in the middle of a crisis, seeing thousands of folks illegally entering every day.
So I know something else that is not 100% agreed on or appreciated is the border fencing. I know you were just down with the President earlier this week talking about how many miles we've implemented. Can you talk a little bit about what we have done in terms of new fencing?
Yes, sir.
What you anticipate will be completed by the end of the year, and your evaluation of the effectiveness of that fencing now that it's in place?
Yes, sir. So first of all, and I think this is something that I try to hit every time, this is not the President's wall. This is the wall system for the United States Customs and Border Protection, for the American people. This is something that when this administration came into being, they ask, what do you need? They actually ask the men and women on the front lines. They asked the leadership of Border Patrol, what do you need? And they said, we need a border wall system. And I say system on purpose, sir, because it's very important. So far, 220 miles of wall system have been built. And people ask me, well, how many new miles have been built? And I say, 220 miles of new wall system. Because it's not just a bunch of metal thrown into the ground. It has integrated lighting, technology, access roads. This new wall system, every mile that's built is a new mile of capability that did not exist before. So it is a new mile of wall when it goes in the ground. So far, 220 miles. And as we have anticipated, we planned, we believe that in this year, we're going to have completed 450 miles of the wall system. And here's the fact. Again, this is not a political statement. This is a factually based statement that I can open the checkbook and show everybody. Everywhere that a wall system has been built as part of a multi-layer strategy of infrastructure, technology, and personnel, all the stats you can imagine go in the right direction. Less people enter in that area. Less drugs come across that area. Less criminals come across that area. Less gang members come across that area. It's just a fact, and we can prove it, and it's effective. It's an effective impedance and denial tool, and every Border Patrol agent on the lines will tell you that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Morgan. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Morgan. The border restrictions at land ports of entry have been, as you know, extended 3 times and are going to remain in place until at least July 2021. These restrictions, while very important, and I understand the importance of them, also have real-world impacts on states like Michigan. For example, hospitals in the Detroit area rely on Canadian doctors and especially nurses, a very large number of nurses across the border daily to work in those hospitals in Detroit. So my question to you, sir, is what factors is CBP considering when determining the need for additional extensions? Are there any particular metrics or criteria that need to be met before reopening?
So first of all, I completely agree with what you just said. And we're seeing the same thing on the northern border and on the southwest border as well. And it even goes beyond, those heroes in the medical profession that are actually coming to the United States to provide this vital service. But it's also economies on both sides. Sir, obviously I don't need to tell you, you're very well aware, is that there are economies on the Mexican side as well as the United States side that thrive and are dependent on each other, especially in the border cities. That's important. And so we have been involved in those discussions. They have sought our input with respect to each time that they've made the decision to first implement the travel restrictions and to implement them additionally to renew them. We are an integral part of that. I can tell you personally, I've had conversations, for example, on the southwest border from Baja to Brownsville of leaders all across the board, not just law enforcement, but local leadership as well, to really listen to them and understand, get a better understanding exactly what they're experiencing. And so when we look at this, it cannot be done just from a public health perspective. It's got to be a balance of the public health risks and the economy. And I feel very confident, at least the elements that I've been involved with in CBP, that we're trying to do just that.
Mm-hmm. So when can we expect details from CBP about what the reopening of the border is going to look like? And specifically, we'll get a better sense of how you engage with our partners like the Canada Border Services Agency. There was some confusion between the U.S. and Canada, as you're well aware. I want to make sure that we have proper guidance so we don't have that kind of confusion as you're starting to reopen. Tell me a little bit about your work with the Canadian government.
So again, I completely agree. There early on, there were some fits and starts, but we had and did and continue to work with our counterparts there to make sure that we're addressing those issues, to make sure that we're implementing these restrictions better. But equally as important as we start to open back up. Now, obviously, as CBP, we don't make that decision when the title restrictions will be lifted or modified. But we are already working both on the northern border and southern border with our partners, what that will look like, how that will look like. We anticipate, for example, in the land border, that when the travel restrictions are lifted, we're going to see, we anticipate it's going to get back to normal pretty quick. Right now, if you look at the pedestrian vehicle traffic, those are down 50 and 60% respectively. We think when we lift those restrictions in the land environment, those numbers are going to get back to normal pretty quick, unlike the air environment. So it's definitely an issue. We're working with them, honestly, I would say almost on a daily basis with our partners.
Yeah, good. Well, we certainly saw some confusion at the beginning stages of the crisis at airports, including Detroit, with travel restrictions, lack of screening protocols, and some of those shortfalls created some dangerous situations with folks waiting in very long lines to get through the process and often not having any kind of protection that they were wearing. And now, months later, if we're looking at infection totals around the globe, they're actually very high and continue to be high. Yet we're also seeing travel now starting to pick up at the same time. So my question to you is, what lessons did CBP learn from securing our border in the early days of COVID-19? And what practices would you plan to resume in the event of a continued resurgence abroad, particularly folks coming from China?
So I'll give you an example, contact tracing. I think that was one of those areas where we had some challenges when we implemented that at the start, and we learned. There's another example in Chicago, same thing, where lines were lengthy. We're trying to look at our system. We have APIS and a couple other systems that we use that we were able to collect the data that CDC needs, but it's cumbersome. It's manually, and it's not efficient. And so early on, that's where you saw is we're trying to collect this information that CDC needs for the very important contact tracing. So what we're doing is we're working with CDC, we're working with the HSS, we're working with the industry stakeholders, for example, in the air environment. I personally have been on a couple of calls. We've had those discussions with what can we do to get better to collect that information. And so that is what we're trying to work towards in the future. And when I say pretty quickly, probably by September, we need to have an interim solution. But what we've done since then, though, immediately, kind of the 3-meter target, if you will, is we changed how we've done that now. So now that contract information, we kind of do it what we call pre-primary, really right after they get off the plane, they deboard from the plane, and we have our DHS contract personnel that are there collecting that information, doing the medical screening, doing and asking the questions that they should while CBP personnel are there. That has absolutely helped tremendously, but we still need to get better on that, and that's why we're still working for a better solution.
Good. Reports indicate that, like the U.S. CIS, CBP is going to face some funding shortfalls as a result of COVID-19 related decrease in the user fees that folks pay. I've worked on a number of provisions to support the hiring and adequate staffing within CBP and worked with you to make that happen, which I appreciate. But I'm concerned about the impact that this shortfall will have on the workforce as well as security at the ports of entry. First question, will you have to furlough officers based on some of the reports that we're seeing? Right now,
Seeing what I see, no. I'm not anticipating that right now. But, sir, you're absolutely right. It's an issue. Right now, I think you probably know better than most, is about 40% of the workforce are funded through user fees. And because and most of those are through the international travel, we're seeing a significant reduction. We're looking at a $600 to $700 million shortfall in user fees. So it's definitely a challenge. We're working with DHS, we're working with OMB, we're working with the appropriators to try to find a solution.
Do you expect that you're going to be requesting some supplemental funding to get through this?
You know, I don't want to get too far ahead of that, but I think we are going to need some help from Congress. What that help is going to look like, I think we're still trying to work through, but we will definitely need some assistance.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Langford.
Chairman, thank you. Mark, thanks so much
We can't hear you.
Oh, it is.
Now, 1, 2, 3.
Still can't hear you, James.
Nope, not on mute, so.
You look great.
Yeah, we can see you just fine.
Yep, I'm not on mute, so it's on your end.
Do we have a technical fix on this, or should we go into Tom for the time being?
Recording studio should be able to fix it right now, but
Testing 1, 2, 3.
go on to Senator Carper.
So if you don't mind, let's go to Senator Carper, and then we'll come back to you once we get your audio fixed. Sorry about that. Senator Carper.
Mr. Morgan, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And I want to join my colleagues in expressing our appreciation and our affection for the men and women that you serve with and leave. It's true that the travel bans, when used effectively and imposed in a timely manner, can help delay the arrival of a highly contagious virus to our shores. But we're reminded just earlier this week by Dr. Julie Gerberding. She's a former CDC director who appeared before our Congress, our committee yesterday. She said back in February, a roundtable, HSGAC roundtable, she said, and I'll quote her, she said, "Once you see sustained community transmission, the horse is out of the barn." And Ron Klain, who was the Ebola czar back a couple of years ago, and quite a successful effort, as you'll recall, he said in February of the president's order blocking travel from China, he said, "We don't have a travel ban." He said, "We have a travel band-aid right now." First, before it was imposed, 300,000 people came here from China in the previous month. So the horse is out of the barn. This week, 7 states reported their highest ever hospitalizations from COVID. 3 months and 121,000 deaths later. Unfortunately, we're still not prepared. I have a friend, and you ask him how he's doing, he always says, compared to what? And I just want to review with you, share with you some numbers that I shared with my colleagues a couple of weeks ago. Compared to what? Let's compare population and deaths in Taiwan to what we faced. Taiwan has about 25 million people. So far, they've suffered 7 deaths. 25 million people, 7 deaths. South Korea has over 50 million people. They have and suffered 274 deaths. Singapore, about 6 million people, 25 deaths. New Zealand, 22 deaths. Australia, 102 deaths. Japan, with 126 million people, 916 deaths. China, with 1.4 billion people, they're reporting about 4,600 deaths. We say let's say they're not telling the truth, let's say it's twice that much. It's still under 10,000. Germany, 83 million people, 9,000 deaths. Canada, our neighbor to the north, 38 million people, 7,800 deaths. Mexico, our neighbors to the south, 128 million people, 14,000 deaths. And the United States, with 328 million people, now we're up to 121,000 deaths. Back in February 28th, the president said the virus said it's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will just disappear. March 6th, he said, anybody that wants a test can get a test. That's what the bottom line is. March 10th, 2020, he said, this was unexpected and we're prepared and we're doing a great job with it. And it will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. March 24th, he said, we've never closed down the country for the flu. So you say to yourself, what is this flu all about? May 20th, 2020, on the U.S. having the most cases in the world at 1.5 million to that date, despite testing shortages. He said, when you say that we lead in cases, that's because we have more testing than anybody else. We don't look at that as a bad thing. That's a badge of honor. A badge of honor to have 121,000 people die from this pandemic. I want to ask you a couple of questions, if I may, Commissioner. And one of those, let me just ask you to just react to what I just shared. Just react to what I've just shared.
Well, sir, I guess my initial thought is I'm not a medical professional. As a acting commissioner of CBP, when we were called upon to implement and provide our guidance and our knowledge with respect to what would be the most appropriate way to implement travel restrictions, both in the air environment, sea environment, and land environment, that's what we did. And I think that the men and women of CBP have done an incredible job doing that. There are areas where individual agencies like the CDC are needing certain type of information, and CBP has done just a yeoman's work to try to improve those processes to get the work they need to be able to safeguard this country. And what I can say is from a public health perspective, that is in our role as CBP, I think we've done an incredible job. I think the efforts that we've taken, both in the air, sea, and land environment, have saved countless. I couldn't even guess how many thousands of American lives have been saved because
I'm going to reclaim my time. Can you imagine, had you not done a great job, how much worse it would be? The numbers that I just shared with you, we've got less than 5% of the world's population. We have over 25% of the world's deaths. And can you imagine how much worse it would have been if CBP hadn't been doing a sterling job? Let me ask you another question, if I can. And last summer, as you'll recall, in response to the growing humanitarian crisis at the southern border, Congress passed and the President signed into law a supplemental appropriations bill of about $4.5 billion. Of that funding, $1.1 billion went to CBP. The funds were to be used to ease severe overcrowding at CBP stations and at ICE detention facilities, lack of adequate healthcare facilities and personnel, and a lack of administrative capacity to support CBP agents and officers. Congress provided the funding with strict instructions on how it should be used and how it should not be used. This month, GAO reported that CBP had misspent a portion of these funds, violating the statutory provisions that govern their use. Among the items purchased with taxpayer funding to ensure the safety of migrants in CBP custody were such items as dirt bikes, motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles, and surveillance equipment. CBP has recommended, rather GAO has recommended, that CBP either adjust its expenditures to account for these deficiencies or that it report a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act as required by law. I would just ask for, I don't have any more time left, but just a yes or no answer. Do you commit to following GAO's recommendations?
absolutely, yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's one way to
Ivan in
solve,
person.
that's one way to solve technological problems. Senator Langford.
Yeah, physical presence does make a difference. Apparently, they could hear me online, but it does make it harder for you to answer the questions, Mark. So you can't actually hear it. Mark, thanks for your work and for your service. Please pass on our condolences to the families of the 7 that we have lost on CBP and a lot of folks that live every day with the threats that are coming at them. As every person coming across the border, they don't get the privilege of being socially distanced from, and they're not wearing masks when they come across. It's a very different environment for them. So for those folks, please tell them thank you for the work that they continue to do. I want to back up on a series of questions dealing with seizures. I know CBP has been very engaged in seizing fake testing kits and fake medications, fake masks, N95 masks. What's the status on that, and what are you seeing?
Absolutely, sir. And unfortunately, every time that there's a crisis, from a law enforcement perspective, the first thing we get together collectively is we set up a task force because we know that criminals are going to take advantage of it. And COVID-19 has been no exception. And that's right. So we've really gotten together as a USG. We've gotten together with a host of investigative agencies to really focus on this. And hundreds of thousands of fake masks have been recovered. Countless COVID tests have been recovered that really could have done serious harm to the American consumer had it gotten into their hands. And this is something that, as we're trying to implement the travel restrictions and stop COVID from coming into our country, we're still been equally as committed to this.
Appreciate that very much. You also made a comment earlier that the number of individuals illegally crossing the border has decreased, and the apprehensions obviously have been along those same lines as well.
the amount of drugs coming into the country has increased per pound. Are you seeing changes in amounts? Are you seeing more meth, more fentanyl, more cocaine? Are there trends that you're seeing in that as well? It's not only total amounts, but are you seeing, what I'm looking for is types of drugs as well?
Absolutely. So the four hard narcotics that I call, they're increasing, and especially from this time last year. I think I said in my opening, methamphetamine, for example, just from last month increased 66%. And I think I'll get the numbers if I'm off a little bit, but from this time last year, it's up 20-30% from this time last year. And what we're seeing, the cartels do what they do best. They change their tactics and techniques quicker than anything that I've ever seen in the history of law enforcement. And so when COVID hit, it impacted them. I'll give you a quick example. So the number of vehicles coming across have dropped by 65%. And so their normal mode was to smaller loads and vehicles and just try to get them through the masses, and it was fairly effective. And now, since the number of vehicles coming through has drastically reduced, that's not working as more. So now they're going to the cargo environment because cargo has continued to flow the entire time. And so now they're taking a little bit risk, and they're actually putting larger loads in the cargo to getting through. So they're shifting. But now we're seeing them take greater risk. They're using pedestrians more, body carries, and we've seen them continue to shift, and they're effective.
We know the cartels make a significant amount of money in transporting families and children across the border. That's been a significant amount, as well as single adults, as the cartels are a major income source, along with drugs, to be able to move people. Obviously, with the significant drop of people, is it your assumption that we're seeing the increase in drugs because they want to be able to keep their same income source? Or why do you think we're seeing the increase in drugs at this point?
Oh, absolutely, sir. I think you're spot on. I think that's part of it. I mean, that's what they do, right? Is they'll go anything to them for a profit. And if something is being hit and taking profit away, they're just going to shift to another entity to make profit. And as I said, so from this time last year, overall pre-COVID, 76% reduction. Since COVID, we've had an overall 84% reduction in the total flow from this time last May. So you can imagine that's taken billions of dollars out of their pocket. So they're absolutely shifting. That's why I think we're going to continue to see an increase of drugs coming in this country. I think that's why we've seen an increase of the hard narcotics increase across the board. They're changing their tactics. They're going into the sea more. They're doing what we call mixed loads now, both drugs and smuggling humans as well. And so they're really branching out. We're seeing them use air more, tunnels more. They're expanding as much as they can.
Okay. The Title 42 authorities dealing with a health emergency and communicable disease overseas and from people transiting into the country at this point. There's a significant amount of authorities that are there. Walk me through how those are actually applied, those Title 42 authorities, and what you think the difference is in the enforcement and the number of people trying to cross. Because obviously there's still a lot of people that want to be able to come to the United States. What difference do you think those Title 42 authorities make, and what are they?
So it's been significant. I think if I can, I have to back up fairly quickly to put it in context. Prior to COVID and prior to Title 42, because of administration initiative policies, we had already made a significant decrease in the flow. Again, 76%. We went from 20,000 in custody to 3,400 in custody prior to COVID. Okay, now COVID, Title 42. What we saw initially, March 21st, within the first probably 2-3 weeks, we saw a 50% decline in those trying to attempt to illegally enter. That was significant. I mean, it really shows that the individual listen to the medical experts, they're self-quarantining, they're not taking the risk from a public health perspective, and it was working. What we've seen now, though, is we're seeing the numbers start to increase a little bit, especially Mexican nationals. So now we've seen that shift in demographics 100%, about 75-80% now Mexican nationals, and that's a shift from what it was last year.
Okay. Do you think that the count of Mexican nationals is increasing or the percentage is increasing?
The percentage is increasing.
Okay, but you think the count is close? Folks that are other than Mexican has declined that much?
That's correct. If you look this time last year, I think it was around 17.5. This past month, it was almost that, but the percentage increased. But what we're concerned about, though, is that, again, as we get on the other side of COVID, Mexico's economy, really, Western Hemisphere's economy is really bad. We think that that's going to create an additional pull factor because of economic conditions.
The last number that I saw was this fiscal year, which would be October the 1st of last year until the end of May this year, about 276,000 people that had been apprehended apprehended that are inadmissible. Those were either at ports of entry or between ports of entry along the southwest border. Does that number seem about right?
Yes, it does.
So around 250,000 at this point that we had picked up during that time period. That's a significant decrease from what we've seen in the past, but that's a very large number. I also thought it was interesting as well. I went back to look at the number of people that were given naturalization last year, to be able to just look at the last year that we have a full year of naturalization. 833,000 people legally went through the process and were naturalized. That's an 11-year high. So one of the things that I just want to be able to mention to you is this administration has continued to be able to accelerate into legal immigration and naturalization with an 11-year high for the number of people that legally went through the process to be naturalized, but have also been very, very focused on declining illegal admissions into the country. So just, again, tell your folks thank you for the work that you continue to do to be able to enforce the law and continue to be able to protect your people. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And I will, if I can, I thank you for that. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member earlier, too, is I will take that back. And I can tell you, the men and women out there, when they hear that from their elected leaders, it means something. So I will take that back, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Langford. We'll try Senator Scott. Try talk and see if we can hear you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I think we can. Turn it up.
Okay, right. So, well, thank you, Chairman Johnson, for hosting this. I want to thank Mr. Morgan and everybody at Customs and Border Protection for what you're doing. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to visit.
We can barely hear you. We can barely hear. We're trying to boost the volume. Do you have volume control on yours?
I can't hear it all.
Is this better? Can you hear me now?
A little bit better, yeah.
Okay. So, so do you maybe go ahead and go, or do you want to go to somebody else first?
Actually, we can hear you pretty good. Just get as close to your.
Okay.
There you go.
Where's the speakers at, sir? I'm still having a hard time hearing.
All right.
Okay.
So, Mr. Morgan, can you hear me?
It's tough, sir.
Okay.
It's not going to be good if the witness can't hear you. So I think we're just going to have to say if you want to come in and ask questions, you're going to have to come down the hearing room or come up to the hearing room.
Okay. All right. Let me try it one more time. Can you hear me now?
Mark, you have to answer that.
I can, but it's not great. We could try it.
Okay, give it a shot.
Okay, well, first off, I just want to thank you for what everybody does at their international mail facilities around the country. I had the opportunity to visit the one down in Miami. And one of the concerns I've got, which I think a lot of us have, is the amount of counterfeit goods that are coming in from communist China. And I want to compliment you for what you're doing all the time. And if you could talk about what Customs and Border Protection is trying to do to stop the amount of counterfeit goods that are coming in from communist China, I would appreciate it.
Yes, sir. So I did hear that. And this is something that is, you're absolutely spot on. This is a significant issue. The counterfeit goods that are coming in, a considerable amount from China, absolutely across the spectrum. If it's made, it's being counterfeited. And many of these items go directly to impact the public health of the consumers here in this country. So we are continuing to work with all the appropriate partners in USG to come up with not only new policies to address, to better position us, but also new techniques and new processes of which will increase our ability to actually identify, detect, and seize and stop those counterfeit goods from coming into this country.
Do you have the resources to be able to do it?
So that's always the question, and it depends on what the scale is. And if you look at the amount of volume, especially on the e-commerce, especially on the de minimis, which I know you're familiar with, the numbers are astronomical that come in. And so that's a challenge. So we're doing some operations, Operation Megaflex, for example, where we're surging resources. We're working with the United States Postal Service as well, where we're surging resources to increase our capacity to seize, interdict, and stop those counterfeit goods. But to say that we have both the technology and the boots on the ground, if you will, to be able to adequately look at everything coming across right now, the answer is no.
The trade deal that we signed with Communist China, did it do anything to require them to try to crack down on either the counterfeit or the substandard products that they ship over to the United States?
Yes, in fact, I've had several conversations with Peter Navarro, and we're working together, and that's exactly something they're trying to drive. That's really the driving factor outside of CBP, but we're fully supportive of that because that's important. If there's not some sort of accountability, then we're not going to see a significant shift. And the last strategic plan that we put out last year had provisions in there where we will, as a USG, be able to hold China more accountable with respect to counterfeit goods.
Are they complying? Are they actually trying to be helpful at all? I mean, my concern that China never complies with anything. They'll say they'll do something, and of course they never do it. I mean, they've never complied with any agreement they've ever signed that I've found.
I think what I'm probably comfortable saying is those dialogues and negotiations are continuing, and we're continuing to look at the data and make an assessment.
Okay. Are there things that Customs and Border Protection is doing now to deal with our airports and how we can make them safer as a result of the COVID or the risk of things coming? Or the risk, I guess it's primarily goods, but coming from outside this country, including Communist China?
Yes, sir. And that mainly, when it comes to a global pandemic, we're mainly going to implement what the medical experts decide. In this case, CDC, our medical professionals within DHS, as well as the medical professionals we have with the CBP. They're engaged. They have been early on, often all day, every day. It seems like they're talking to each other, and they're trying to come up with new solutions on how we can make that environment safer for passengers that are coming in. I think a key important element to that is also the stakeholders, the airlines. So we are working with the airlines. In fact, last week I participated personally in a couple of trade day conversations when we talked to the airlines, and we specifically had conversations about this. How can we do that? Because part of this is balancing that public health risk, but also increasing consumer awareness and their comfortableness with flying again. That's critical. So we've got to balance that, both of those needs.
Yeah, it's pretty important to the Florida economy to be able to get individuals comfortable flying again. I think there's things that, of course, government can do, but a lot of it has to be done at the airline level to get people comfortable. I just want to finish by thanking you for what you do. I want to thank you for everybody at Customs and Border Protection for what they do every day to try to keep Americans safe and try to make sure American products that come in here are not, counterfeit. They're not things that are bad for us. So I want to thank, if you'll thank everybody on behalf of me from the state of Florida. I'm very appreciative of what y'all do.
Yes, sir, I absolutely will. Thank you.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Senator Johnson, Ranking Member Peters, for having this important oversight hearing today. And, of course, Acting Commissioner Morgan, appreciate you being here in person with us today as well. I want to talk a little bit about the entry restrictions for children. So on March 21st, 2020, CDC and DHS suspended admission of certain immigrants, regardless of their country of origin, purportedly due to the health concerns of COVID-19. Reports indicate that under new policy, DHS has deported nearly 3,000 unaccompanied children arriving at the U.S. border instead of transferring them to the Office of Refugee Resettlement Custody as required by federal anti-trafficking law. The Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or TVPRA, as it's a lot easier to say that, the removal really places these children at risk of human trafficking, persecution, and other grave harm. So is CBP transferring unaccompanied children arriving at the U.S. southern border to ORR custody and screening them as required by law?
So the answer is yes and no. So Title 42, and I think this is important, being obvious here, but as we're in this midst of this public health pandemic, this global pandemic, the priority must be to contain and mitigate the spread of this virus and to keep it from further being introduced in the U.S. But ma'am, I can assure you that CBP, through implementing the CDC order, it's consistent with law, policy, including our now non-refoulement obligations.
Can you tell me do you know how many unaccompanied children you've removed since March 21st?
Yes, I have those numbers.
And then while you're looking for those, do you have the number of how many weren't screened for trafficking or protection concerns? Because
Yes.
that's what we're concerned about.
Yes, ma'am. So I have this down. I'll make sure that I'll follow up with my staff to make sure the numbers are right. But approximately under Title 42, the CDC order, about 2,000 were processed under Title 42, and just shy of 300 were processed under Title 8. And they would go to the normal procedure through.
So only 300 were screened out of the 2,000?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. So they're all screened. And
They
again,
were 100% of these kids were screened for trafficking and protection concerns?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So that doesn't change. So we're still, if we see anybody, any signs that someone's trafficked, then they're going to fall out of Title 42, and they're going to be then treated under
Okay,
Title.
regardless of seeing of signs, the regulation is all unaccompanied minors are screened. You're screening all unaccompanied minors. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, ma'am. We are complying with our non-refoulement requirements under the law. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. I want to move on a little bit now to a little bit of transparency and oversight, as is the this is a commission hearing on oversight. And so Nevada, of course, we're home to thousands of immigrant families. They make up the part of the diverse fabric of our state and of our country. And too often, unfortunately, I hear concerns from our state's immigrant community and advocates about DHS oversight when it comes to investigating abuse by ICE and CBP personnel, including sometimes racist remarks made by Border Patrol agents at the southern border. So can you please give us a little insight into what accountability measures are in place for CBP agents and their officers who engage in verbal abuse or other forms of misconduct directed at immigrants?
It's handled like any allegation of misconduct, ma'am. So we have a robust Internal Affairs Office of Professional Responsibility. It used to be called
So
Internal
could you
Affairs.
describe the grievance process then? The immigrant has to make the claim, another officer makes the claim. Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
Well, it depends on the circumstance, but if an individual, if an immigrant feels that they have been mistreated in any form or fashion, yes.
So what is their process? If I'm an immigrant, I'm in custody at the border, I've been a victim of some form of abuse or comment, how do I go about talking about that?
There's a variety of options to them.
Just
ma'am.
give me one
I
example.
could give you one. They could report it to a supervisory CBPO or Border Patrol agent.
And then where is the oversight in there that they have some way to get their claim heard?
Right. So then the process is, then that claim, like for this example, if it's reported to a supervisor, Border Patrol agent, or CBPO, then that allegation will immediately go to our joint intake center and our Office of Professional
And have you conducted an
Responsibility.
independent review of this process?
Yes, yes. We actually have a cadre of hundreds of special agents that this is what they do. Their full-time job is to investigate allegations.
And so
of
have you
misconduct.
produced reports of this independent review? Is there something that we can look at and see?
Yes, ma'am. Every year. Every year. In fact, the 2018 report just recently came out.
Well, it's 2020, so can we see that? Can you please direct that to us so we can see how the grievance process
Yes, ma'am.
is?
We work with your staff to get you whatever current information we have. Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess that we could also talk a little bit. I guess I have about a minute left. And so how about if we talk a little bit about the Remain in Mexico program, the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. 2 months ago, DHS and Office of Immigration Review announced they're going to be rescheduling all those MPP hearings due to COVID-19. So people in Mexico awaiting their court dates, they're forced to travel to their destination port only to find that their date, they've traveled unnecessarily only to find that their date has been changed, to receive notice that they have a new hearing date. And so I think this is a short-sighted policy, and how do we be sure that people aren't traveling just to find out that they can't get there? So can you tell me how many immigrants waiting in Mexico for their scheduled court date were required to make the journey back just to receive notice of the postponed court dates?
So I'm not aware of that, ma'am. My understanding was we communicated that out. If those circumstances where they had to come, we can take a look at that. And
I'd like to see some numbers on that if I
Yes, ma'am.
could.
We can get better at that. But I can assure you the decision behind continuing to postpone this, I fully support. I mean, as Mexico cases continue to rise, deaths continue to rise, and really in the Western Hemisphere, Brazil now has become the epicenter. Latin America really has become higher than the European countries as far as the number of cases. So it's still a real threat.
So if you're going to change the court date and you're going to require someone to come in person to receive that TARE notice or however that notice is, can you modify that policy to let them know so they don't have to make this trip unnecessarily just to find out that they can't be there?
My understanding that wasn't happening, but if that was, yes, ma'am, we can get better at that.
I appreciate that. I look forward to hearing those numbers. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So I don't see Senator Hawley. Don't think he's coming in. So go next to Senator Romney, then it'd be Senator Hassan, then Senator Portman. But Senator Romney.
Yes, can you hear me?
We actually can, yes.
Good, thank you.
Talk as loud as you can, though.
Okay, I've got a big voice. I'll do my very best. First, I want to express appreciation to your entire team for the work that you do, helping keep our country safe from products that are coming in that are adulterated that could cause harm to our citizens, products that are also coming in that are not adulterated but are themselves going to cause harm to our citizens. And I'm talking about, of course, drugs and other illegal substances, and also protecting our workforce from those who would come in and take jobs that they're not qualified or authorized to take. One of the things I learned on my trip to the border in San Diego, as I met with Border Patrol agents and, in fact, with the head of the Border Patrol agent union, he said to me something interesting. He said, you know, one of the problems we have is that the magnet is so strong, people are going to find a way to get here whether we like it or not. And I said, what magnet are you talking about? And he said, the magnet I'm talking about is the job magnet, which is if people can earn $10 an hour on one side of the border and $1 an hour on the other side of the border, they're going to try and move from one to the other. They're going to come to America for the opportunity for a better paying job and also for a better future for their kids. And his point was that, yes, it's important to have a wall built to make it more difficult for people to cross into our country illegally. But that if we really want to stop the amount of illegal immigration that comes in and takes American jobs, that we're going to have an effective way to prevent people from getting American jobs if they're here illegally. And that's why, of course, the nation has our E-Verify system, and yet this is not mandatory. Businesses of all kinds are not required and not using the system to determine if someone is here legally or illegally. I guess the question is, what is your perspective and the perspective of the people you work with on what we need to do, not just to build a wall, which is important and I support, but also to change the conditions in our country so that we reduce the incentive for people to come here illegally?
Yes, sir. So you are spot on. The job magnet statement, I completely agree with. That's what we see. That is absolutely, without a doubt, the overwhelming majority of the pull factor is that they are coming here for economic reasons. That's a fact. That's not hyperbole. It's a fact. So you're absolutely right. So we have got to do things collectively as USG, as a Congress, to pass meaningful legislation to address those incentives. Job factors. We need to continue to make sure and hold employers accountable that continue to hire people that are in this country illegally. If we do not do that, they're going to continue to come. No matter how bad our economy is in this country, it's worse elsewhere. And that's what we're seeing right now with COVID. If not, they wouldn't keep coming. It's just, you know, a little bit of common sense. So you're absolutely right on that. And there's more incentives, though, than just the jobs. I mean, incentives that once they get here, they know that they're going to be able to stay here and remain. We have so many loopholes in our system, and that's why, with all due respect, I've been saying for a long time, we still need Congress to step up to pass meaningful legislation to address this crisis, to actually address the incentives. So I agree with you. I will say, though, the wall is still a very important thing because it helps us with drugs and criminals and a lot of other bad stuff coming in as well. We need to do it all, including the wall.
Yeah, thank you. I do agree. I'm one of those that's pushing for mandatory e-verify. Yep. and penalizing companies, penalizing employers that do not use e-verify, penalizing them just like we do if they don't pay their taxes, they get in trouble. I'd have the same kind of penalties associated with not using e-verify and hiring people that are here illegally. I welcome, as Senator Langford indicated, legal immigration, and the fact that that's been enhanced is good news. But illegal immigration is not fair to the millions of people who would like to come here ultimately and want to do so legally. Of course, the other issue relates to drugs coming into our country. And I don't know that you have any recommendations in that regard. There's, of course, as long as there's demand, as long as there are people here willing to spend a lot of money to buy drugs, the drugs are going to find a way to get into this country, either through the mail system or through tunnels that people dig or in the ocean or in aircraft. I mean, they will find a way. Do you or do your colleagues have any thoughts about what we could do to reduce the demand pull, the magnet, if you will, that has been a scourge for so long in our country, a health scourge, but also a real challenge, I'm sure, for you and your agents as you seek to try and close off as many avenues as possible?
Sir, again, I think you're spot on. I say often we're not going to seize our way out of this drug problem. That's not going to happen. This really does take a whole of government approach to this as well. And so as we're looking at the criminal element, as we're targeting the TCOs, we also have to address that very real demand side in this country. If we're going to solve the problem, it has to be simultaneously attacking that. But you're right. We're seeing drugs come in the mail environment. We're seeing come in through the air environment, through the sea environment, the land environment. You name it, they're using every technique that they can. But the Attorney General Barr, is spearheading a USG collective approach how we can get better to target the cartels, target the smuggling organizations. CBP is an integral part of that. And we're making some headway. We're continuing to improve our strategies so that positions ourselves to more effectively go after these cartels and hopefully try to disrupt them as much as we can.
Thank you, Director. Appreciate your response to these questions and very much appreciate the work that you and your team are carrying out in behalf of our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Romney. Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Morgan, for coming before the committee. And I just want to add my thanks to those you've already heard, for the men and women of CBP for all the hard work they do. And I join my colleagues in mourning the loss of the officers that we've lost. I want to follow up a little bit on questions that Senator Langford and now Senator Romney have asked you about the drugs that are trafficking across our border, but I want to focus on fentanyl. As you know, my state and many states continue to grapple with the effects of opioid abuse stemming from the trafficking of drugs like fentanyl. Our latest numbers in New Hampshire, unfortunately, indicate that overdose deaths are keeping pace with recent years in the midst of this pandemic, if not being slightly higher. Can you please provide me with an update on fentanyl and other drug seizures at the southern border and all other points of entry during the pandemic?
So, for the most part, it hasn't slowed down. We saw, early on this year, the height of COVID, we saw drugs across dip down a little bit, but I said in the last 30 days in May, they went back up to include meth and fentanyl both. In fact, Border Patrol seizures in between the ports of entry of meth has gone up. Okay. So it's still there, and it's still coming, and it's still a problem.
And are they still using the same essential strategies on fentanyl?
Yes.
Okay. Can you also please update us on efforts to combat illegal trafficking of fentanyl through the U.S. mail system from countries like China? Have we seen any changes in patterns since the start of the pandemic?
We have, and actually I go forward before the pandemic. So that's really where we made our strides. So we worked with China. We got them to schedule certain drugs that made it illegal in China. So China was working with us, but that was dramatic. In the mail environment, we saw drugs coming in from China specifically go down dramatically. And this has really been, pre-COVID. Okay. We're working with the United States Postal Inspector Service. We're doing operations. I mentioned Megaflex. We're specifically targeting the mail environment, and we've seen that go down. But the cartels, what do? They just have the precursor chemicals sent right to Mexico. They have their own chemists.
Right.
They're developing themselves now.
That's right. Okay. Well, thank you for that update. I also want to follow up a little bit on something that Senator Carper mentioned. A Government Accountability Office review of emergency border security aid expenditures appropriated by Congress revealed that CBP spent funds reserved for migrant care and aid on CBP border equipment like motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles, and boats. After the release of this audit, your agency has conceded that the GAO report is accurate and that CBP was at fault for spending these funds incorrectly. I really appreciate that forthrightness and admission, but I'd like to know specifically how much was misspent on equipment. Can you give us those numbers, please?
So what it can do is 95% of the $1 billion emergency supplement, there were no errors. And what they found was there was a chunk of 112 million that there were some issues. 60 million of that is what is really in question. And so some of that, about half of that, we believe were due to some technical errors. I'm not an accountant, but basically we put it in the wrong line. And so it was a technical area. 30 million is really what is left we think is in question. It still requires some further analysis and kind of a legal opinion with respect to that, and we're working with the GAO audit on that. Again, glad they did the audit. The last thing I would say is we believe that there was no violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, meaning we believe all the charges appear to be valid CBP operating expenses. We just may have put them in the wrong buckets.
So what you're telling me is it may have been as much as $30 million of aid that Congress appropriated for emergency purposes, which was intended to address an overwhelming crisis from last summer. I know that I appreciate, again, that you guys are being forthright, but it's important that you're fixing this after the GAO audit. But why isn't CBP doing a real-time audit of these numbers in order to ensure that misspent emergency aid can be refocused in an equally timely manner? So
two things, ma'am. And if I misspoke, I apologize. I'm not saying that we actually agree that the money was misspent. Again, that 30 million is what we believe is what requires further analysis. And so what we think it was technical errors of which we need to correct, and we need to get better and make sure that doesn't happen. But we do not believe that there was any violation, again, of the Anti-Deficiency Act going forward.
Well, as I read the summary of the GAO report, I might differ with that because I think expenditures on certain kinds of vehicles aren't connected to the kind of emergency care that Congress intended that funding to be spent on, and I look forward to following up with you all on that.
Absolutely.
One last question. Last fall, I traveled to Afghanistan in part to assess U.S. efforts to battle opium production by Afghan poppy farmers and the Taliban. Unfortunately, it appears that opium farming remains widespread, and we have made far less progress than I would have liked, and I'm sure all of us would have liked on this effort. We also learned that the opium farmed in Afghanistan generally supplies Europe and Canada and rarely makes its way to the United States. However, my state shares a border with Canada, as do many of my fellow committee member states. If U.S. forces withdraw completely from Afghanistan without addressing opium production, how do you think this will affect our ability to stop opioid trafficking efforts into the U.S.?
You know, ma'am, I'm really not positioned to be able to definitively address that, but obviously, as you stated, that is a problem. That is a problem that has to be addressed, and that's why we need to, and I know we are attacking this as a USG problem. And it's not just, we're not just attacking this and waiting for this stuff to come to our borders. We're trying to get out there and stop it from coming to our borders.
Well, and I thank you for that. One of my concerns is that as we continue to attempt to slow drug trafficking from our southern border, if our northern border is considerably more porous, and we know that opium from Afghanistan goes to Canada, that gives traffickers a whole nother strategy to pursue. So,
yes, ma'am.
Again, I'd look forward to continuing this conversation with a whole of government approach. Thank you.
And you well know most of the drugs coming in come from outside our borders. So,
thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, Senator Portman, we'll see if we can hear you.
How's that, Mr. Chairman?
Actually, very good. Great. Thank you.
Thank you for holding the hearing. And Mark, thank you for being here. I first of all want to say that I think during the COVID-19 period, your people haven't gotten the credit they deserve to be able to keep our transportation system working well. And Having traveled a lot on airplanes in the last couple months, I can say that people are back. You know, the airports are not entirely full again, but planes, instead of being 10% and instead of being 25%, are now 80% full that I've been on. And the people you have who are putting their own health at risk every day are to be commended. And I thank you for that. And please pass along our gratitude for all of those individuals for helping to protect all Americans as we try to get this economy back going again in the midst of continued concerns about COVID. One question I have for you, you know, I've talked to your people, I've talked to them about the importance of the masks and the hand sanitizer and the gloves and so on. What has the incidence of COVID been among your people that you can attribute to infections that are resulting from interaction with passengers? Have you had an issue there?
So that's a hard one to quantify, but overall I would say yes, clearly. And if you look at as well, the epicenter for us as CBP, it's kind of mirrored what's happened in the United States. So our first largest degree of COVID-related outbreak for our personnel happened in New York a few weeks ago. And now, as expected, as we're starting to get additional outbreaks in Texas and Arizona and California, the trend for CBP personnel is following that. What is hard to determine sometimes is whether they got that from community spread outside of work or they got that while at work. But again, I know I'm saying the obvious here. As you said, they're out there every day, especially right now on the southwest border. They're having to, you know, not everybody is giving up down there. A lot of these folks are running from them. And they're having to go down and get up close and have close contact, high-risk contact that we could call it. So they're definitely exposed. We've had several hundred that have tested positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thanks for helping to keep Americans safe and also to keep your people safe. On the kids, I think about 22,000 unaccompanied UACs, kids have come in. And as you know, we've done a lot of work on this issue in the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations and some of the poor interagency communication between HHS, DHS. My sense is some of that is better. I want to hear from you on that. But my general point would be, I'm pleased to hear that you continue to do the screenings on trafficking. None of us want to see these kids trafficked. And it is in the COVID era, a different situation. I know you have to return some people because of the fear of the COVID being spread, but I want you to know that I appreciate your personal commitment to continuing the screening for trafficking.
And so if I could real quick, so if we go back to May of this time last year, we were averaging about 370 children a day. Now it's 31. That is just tremendous. And those children that under Title 42 that we do return, we are intensely working with the government that we're returning to make sure that they are returned in a safe, humane, compassionate manner, and then make sure that those countries that we're returning to are working to return them with their families. I mean, this process actually that's what we're trying to do. We're actually trying to reunite the children with their families back in their home country.
Well, and that's exactly what we should be doing. You know, as you know, I got involved with this egg farm issue in Marion, Ohio, my home state, where you had kids actually returned to the traffickers by HHS. My sense is that the reforms have been put in place to help on that.
Yes.
With regard to Customs and Border Protection and the fentanyl issue, you didn't mention the STOP Act earlier, and this committee, as you know, passed the STOP Act. We got it through Congress, and what it did was it required the Postal Service for the first time to require this advanced electronic data so that your people can identify the packages coming from China and elsewhere that might have fentanyl in them. And we required 100% from China, by the way, for good reason. Can you give us a report on that? My sense is we're not quite at 100%. We were at 86% as of last year. And my sense is that this has been very successful. Already, the FedExes and the DHSs, the other private carriers, had to provide this data. You all were in their distribution centers. You were finding the contraband. Now you're doing it with the post office. As a result, the traffickers have shifted their means of entry in the United States, and more of it's coming across the border now instead of through the mail. But can you give us a sense of how you've been working with the Postal Service in particular, and whether you think that's working well, whether the STOP Act needs to be improved, or whether you think it's actually effective at stopping this fentanyl that was coming almost entirely through the mail at one point and then primarily through the mail?
So I don't know. I'll have to get back to you, sir, on the exact stats of the percentage we're at right now, but we can get back to you on that. But the work of CBP and the Postal Service, it is a great relationship. It's a great partnership. We have been working together for a very long time. I think I mentioned a couple of times the Operation Megaflex that we've done, and because of that work, we've actually went out to the corporate world, and we put a statement out there saying, hey, we need some folks to come up with innovative ideas on how we can get better at detecting drugs in the mail environment. And that's being worked on right now. So we're continuing to do things to improve our ability to do that. But you're spot on. And like I said earlier, we attacked that together, kind of a USG perspective, and we saw a dramatic increase, especially coming from China. But as you said, unfortunately, they're just shipping it now directly to Mexico, and it's coming across the land border.
Yeah. And by the way, the best thing we can do to help you is stuff like the STOP Act, which required the post office to do what they refused to do. The Interdict Act also provided funding for some of this technology to be able to help you do your job. So let us know where we can be helpful. I think the place we can be most helpful right now, frankly, is on the prevention, treatment, and recovery side to try to reduce that demand that drives so much of this with these huge profits you talked about earlier. And we were making great progress there with regard to opioids. As you know, in the 3 years before COVID hit, we finally had reductions for the first time ever in any way you measure it, including the number of overdoses and overdose deaths. Now I think we're back up again, unfortunately. At least in my home state of Ohio, we're seeing more overdose deaths in some cities than we had last year or the year before, getting back to our high level of 2017. So we got to do a better job to help you to reduce that demand, because otherwise you have an impossible job. Very much the same as we were talking about the importance of the E-Verify system in immigration, that magnet of jobs, whether it's the magnet of the demand for drugs here or the magnet for jobs. On E-Verify quickly, our big issue has been the identifier. So the E-Verify system, in my view, ought to be mandatory. I think Senator Romney spoke well about that. I agree with him, but the issue is these employers who say, yeah, I accepted the ID, which was a social security card and a driver's license that were issued in my state and seemed valid, but they're fraudulent. And it's been difficult for us to figure out a way without a national identifier to be able to assure that the person is, in fact, someone who should be in this country and is here legally. What are your thoughts about fraudulent documents and identifiers and how we can address that issue, which is really the bottleneck in having an effective E-Verify system?
Well, what I'd say, so as you know, it's a little, E-Verify is outside of CBP. It really is in ICE's purview, but so I want to be cautious not to speak on behalf of Director Alberts for ICE, but it's a challenge.
That, but it affects your guys and women as they're trying to do their job, unless we can deal with the demand, again, in this magnet. So I hope, what if you could weigh in a little bit this morning, and then my time has expired, but also just stay engaged in this issue, because you're telling them this helps us to be able to do our job, I think, may be effective in getting us to a better system.
Yes, sir. And we have those discussions all the time. So even though it's outside my purview, trust me, I'm on board. Again, we have to get better at holding those companies that are intentionally hiring illegal workers. We have to hold them accountable. But it's a complicated, tough matter to investigate.
Yeah, I will say there's some new technology, facial recognition technology that people are talking about. Because again, you can't rely on these documents, many of which are fraudulent. You can buy a Social Security card apparently for $25 on the street that's fraudulent, but effective sometimes for those purposes. So thank you again. Thank you to people. Tell them that we appreciate what they're doing every day.
Thank you. I will.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Morgan, for the past several weeks, as you know, people from all walks of life have been demonstrating in all the 50 states. And they're protesting the unlawful killing of, in particular, black men and women by police. According to a government document obtained by Yahoo News, at least 400 CBP personnel have been deployed to some of these marches. I sent you a letter on June 5th asking, and it was joined by my colleagues, asking you a number of questions that included what identification and equipment your personnel are carrying, what forms of force are they authorized to use, and what surveillance are you conducting during these deployments. I have not received a response. Can you give me today a date that I can expect to get that response?
I'll get with the staff, ma'am, and we'll get that to you as fast as we can.
By the end of next week, please.
We'll do our best to do that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And given your mission to focus on our borders, why are you deploying your folks to these protests?
Because we were asked.
By whom?
By a few different individuals. And it's not just that we deployed resources to the National Capital Region. We also deployed resources all over this country.
I'm glad you brought that up. Which states did you deploy them to?
I have that information. I can provide that to you. I think it was 11 or 12 states that we deployed. And we got those requests from a variety of individuals. We got some of those requests from other federal agencies, but we also received those requests directly from state and local police departments that were specifically requested a certain type of assistance.
Great. So I look forward to the follow-up, and if you could include, just as you've mentioned, not only where you've deployed, but also the requester.
Yes, ma'am. We have all that information.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As you know, U.S. Customs and Border Protection is the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country and has, unfortunately, a documented history of abuse and misconduct allegations. And there's a 2014 analysis that I'm familiar with by the American Immigration Council of 809 complaints of abuses by Border Patrol agencies from 2009 through to 2012, which found that in 97% of the cases in which an outcome was reported, no action was taken against the officer. The complaints included hitting someone's head against a rock, stomping on someone's back, touching women inappropriately, kicking a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry. In a 2017 report, on 2,178 complaints from 2012 to 2015, the percentage of cases with reported outcomes where no action was taken against the officer was 96%. So obviously the people in the streets are marching because of their concern about those cases where law enforcement has abused its power and exercised excessive force. How are you dealing with these cases in your agency? Because obviously these numbers are troubling when in the high 90% range, there's no action taken on these complaints. Do you believe that that number reflects the actual behaviors that have been reported? Or and are you confident that you've conducted the investigations accurately and adequately?
So I'm not sure what you're implying by that totally, but to answer that question is, yes, I have confidence in the system. I think we have a robust process.
So let me just, so I can clarify.
Allegation of misconduct, that it is fully investigated.
So I'll clarify. So where there were 809 complaints, there was no action taken in 97% of the cases. So you're confident that only 3% of those cases were actionable?
I'm confident, ma'am, that we, like you said, we're the largest law enforcement organization. 61,000. Now, a single allegation of misconduct is important, but if you look at that number in perspective, that number is actually very low for a workforce of 61,000. And what I will say is that I am confident in this system. Is it a perfect system? I would never say that, but I'm confident in this system that we have a cadre of individuals within our own agency as well as outside agencies. These allegations of misconduct are routinely reviewed from the local district attorney's office, as you well know, to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, as well as our own internal mechanism as well.
What is
so
your
I'm
internal?
confident in that system.
What is your internal mechanism? Is there a division within your agency?
Yes, ma'am.
What is the name of that division?
Office of Professional Responsibility. Back then, it would have been called Internal Affairs. So we have hundreds and hundreds of special agents that are dedicated. Their whole job, 24/7, is to do nothing but investigate allegations of misconduct.
And do you report these investigations and outcomes in a public report?
We put out a report every year. Yes, ma'am.
And that report, what is the name of that report?
Yeah, I don't know the title of the report off the top of my head.
So you produced one last year as well?
The last one that I've seen is 2018, and they're working on 2019s.
Okay, when do you expect that to be complete?
I don't have that information, but I can get that to you.
Okay, and how are you ensuring then that your personnel who are now being deployed to these demonstrations are complying with your rules and your ethical rules as well?
So, one, they're trained, and so they fully understand what their use of force guidelines are. We have an appropriate leadership and supervision that is there also. And then we, like we always do when there's a special deployment, we have briefings and the totality of the circumstances are explained to them, what their mission is and what the expectations are.
And so do you have in written documents an outline of what are your stages of discipline for specific types of behavior of your agents when they break the rules or break the law?
Absolutely. It's well documented and pretty extensive.
Can you provide our committee with that, please?
Of course. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. And since March 20th of this year, there was a policy that your agency has implemented that turns away people who come to our border without fully letting them make their case for why they are in danger in their home countries and deserve refuge in the United States. By many accounts, this policy denies these folks due process and access to our asylum protections. Since implementation of this policy, I understand you've turned away 43,000 people, and reportedly at least 2,175 of them are unaccompanied children.
Ma'am, what policy are you referring to?
The policy that you initiated on March 20th,
CDC order. 2020,
yes?
Right. So that was actually not a DHS or CBP policy. That was actually a CDC directive and order under Title 42.
Which you implemented.
Directed us to implement.
Right, that's what I said.
For the public health of the country. Yes, ma'am.
Right, you implemented it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So public health experts have said that this policy, quote, fails to protect public health and, quote, disregards alternative measures that could protect public health while preserving access to asylum and other protection. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to submit a package of letters from these organizations into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. So, Commissioner Morgan, I understand today you testified that you have expelled about 2,000 unaccompanied children. Is that right?
We have removed approximately 2,000 children under the CDC Title 42 order to ensure the public health and reduce the introduction of COVID-19 in this country. Yes.
And have any of those children suffered violence, trafficking, assault, or any other harm after you turned them away?
We work extensively with the government of the countries that they're being returned to make sure that they are returned in a safe, humane, compassionate way, and that they are actually reunited with their parents in their home country.
Have you received any reports of any of those children that you've turned away,
No,
having been exposed then to any type of abuse or harm?
I've not seen any report.
Have you been told of any reports of that?
I have not been told of any specific child that under the CDC order that we returned to their country of origin that was a victim of abuse.
And my last question on this point, how many of those children have been reunified with their family?
We would have to work with the government that we returned them to get that information. The governments would have that information. We don't track that information.
Is there a reason you don't track that information if you are concerned about their safety after you turn them away?
Because we rely on the country of origin for them to reunite them with their family.
I'd ask that you consider putting in place a policy where you do track whether those children are actually reunified with their families once you turn them away.
We can look at that, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Harris. Mr. Morgan, again, thank you. Thank the men and women that work in your agency. They're putting their lives on the line. Again, tragically lost 7 due to COVID, but we've also had, over the years, tragically, other CBP officers that have lost their lives in the line of duty. So law enforcement is hard. I, for one, I think you saw pretty unanimously that this committee, we truly appreciate their level of service and sacrifice, so please pass that along to them as well. So thank you for your testimony, for your time. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 10th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.